Okay, good morning. Today we're going to be covering some piano pieces. So this week we're covering some chromaticism and harmony and melody and focusing mostly on Chopin, not Chopin. So we have the Revolutionary Etude in C minor and the Nocturne in E flat major, both awesome piano pieces. And as we discussed briefly last time, the piano had a lot of inventions and creations, developments that made it a true solo instrument. And one of the reasons that the piano is still kind of the universal instrument in the Western world, right? Pretty much everyone plays the piano at some time in their life, if not the piano, the violin. And the piano has sort of become the kind of standard instrument that we just hear. We don't. It almost has become neutral, as opposed to a clarinet or a trumpet. The piano makes us. It's so ubiquitous that we now hear it as just, it's just an accepted part of music that we would hear the piano, right? So it's not jarring or different to us. So we have a lot of piano pieces for the rest of our time. And that makes sense because the piano really became, that was the big development in the Romantic period in terms of instruments. Okay, so let's get started. R20 and 21. All right, Friedrich Chopin. Notice his birth and death dates. Again, didn't live terribly long, but did a lot in his life. Friedrich Chopin was born near Warsaw, Poland. His father was a Frenchman who had gone to Warsaw to teach French, his mother a Polish piano teacher. He began to study piano and wrote his first piece of music at age 7. He performed publicly for the first time when he was 8, and at 10 he played for the Tsar of Russia, who gave him a diamond ring. At age 19, he heard the violinist Paganini and was inspired to become a virtuoso performer himself. Remember, virtuoso means like master. He improvised a great deal of piano music, often based on Polish dances like the Polonaise or the mazurka. Those are just different types of dances, but rarely wrote down his compositions. By the time he was 21, however, he had composed 2 piano concertos and moved to that year to Paris, leaving Poland forever. All right. So we've got in our romantic listening list. So now we're talking about Chopin. So father was French and mother was a piano teacher. Spent most of his young life, his youth, that's what we say, spent most of his youth in Poland, but after 21 moved to Paris. Chopin settled in Paris where he continued to compose. His brilliance as a pianist made him a sought-after performer, although he mainly performed in salons. In fact, Chopin gave fewer than 50 public concerts in his entire lifetime. His friends were among the most important artists of the period, Liszt, Berlioz, and Delacroix. When he was 26, he met the author Aurore Dudevant, a woman who often dressed as a man and who published under the name George Sand. That's a pseudonym that happened. So just to talk about that a little bit. So women, for whatever reason, sometimes it was because maybe they felt that women weren't respected enough. Um, there were certainly different viewpoints about women back in this time. And so we do have women who are authors, women who are composers, who would uh, write under a pseudonym, which means a fake name, and it would sound like a man. So that way they would be taken more seriously. That's how they felt. And then I'm not an expert in this, but I'm sure there was definitely some truth to that. Okay, moving on. It was a stormy relationship. They were very different people. He, the dreamy poet, she caught up in social concerns, radical causes, and early feminism. They lived together for 11 years. For much of their life together, he suffered from tuberculosis, the disease that would ultimately kill him. She apparently looked after him devotedly, even though he was difficult to manage. They parted bitterly in 1847, and his health became worse. That's sad. Although he had ceased composing by that time, he continued to give concerts until the winter of 1848 and died the following fall at the age of 39. Although considered a great composer, his life was not without trouble. He was often suffering from illness and had personal troubles. Just keep it simple. All right. Chopin is the only major composer to have so completely oriented his creative life around the piano. Almost all his compositions are for solo piano. He wrote 2 piano concertos, but the orchestration for them is a little thin. His style is so personal that a Chopin piece is immediately recognizable. He seemed to know instinctively what would work on the piano and made great use of the piano's new abilities. Chopin's short works for pianos are generally either dances or free-form pieces. The dances are waltzes, polonaises, and mazurkas. Chopin's waltzes were not made to dance to, and he intended them to be performed with rubato. And we talked about rubato, a strict waltz rhythm that would have taken away much of their expressiveness. Mazurkas and polonaises are Polish dances, and Chopin used them to express his nationalist feelings. So remember, the Romantics don't like things being strict, so they want to leave some room up to the performer. So that's why that rubato is super important. The free form pieces include the preludes, etudes, nocturnes, and impromptus. All these pieces follow the relatively simple ABA structure, although often the second A section is considerably different from the first. The preludes are like Bach's preludes, a complete set of each major and minor key. The nocturnes are lyrical and melancholy, and the etudes are, as the word suggests, studies meant to work on one particular technique. Although Chopin brought studies to a new height, creating real masterpieces, impromptu suggests improvisation, although these works are not quite that casual. Okay, so there's a lot of like terms that we need to just kind of talk to, and these are just different names of pieces. Whoa. All right. Chopin is unique in that most of his compositions center around the piano. His style is immediately recognizable. There we go. The forms he chose were simple ABA or free form, which just means there's not a strict form. His piano music is very advanced. Okay. Chopin did compose a few larger works. He wrote 4 dramatic ballads, as well as the Fantasia in F minor, and a series of scherzos. There are 2 piano concertos and 3 sonatas. Chopin liberated the piano from its role in relationship to the orchestra and the voice, and his works have remained central to the pianist's repertoire. So, what's that mean? The piano prior to Chopin was a background or accompaniment instrument. Chopin elevated the piano to a true solo instrument. Cool. All right, that's all we have for Chopin. One thing I want to do is go through chromaticism with you. So we're going to talk a little bit about chromaticism and what we really mean by that. Okay, so when we're talking about anything chromatic, right, this word chromatic, what we're talking about is half steps. So as you see here, we have a C. That'd be like the white key on the piano. And if we go up to the very next black key with no space in between, we get a C sharp and then a D. So whether the chromatic melody is moving up by half step or whether the harmony is moving and shifting by half step, either of these things are what make it chromatic. I found this video, which we'll play a little bit of, and the guy has a really nice British accent, so I think you'll enjoy that. So he's going to just take us through a little bit of what chromatic harmony is, and then I will explain a bit further. I'm going to use, normally I wouldn't use a video like this, but I think the visuals are better if we're doing this online thing, rather than having me try to write on a whiteboard and project that. So here we go.
This is a starting point, a single note melodic line that moves in chromatic fashion, that is, by semitone steps. A chromatic group, so called, involves 3 movements in which the first and the third notes are differentiated by acquiring unique alphabet letters, while the second member of the group takes on a chromaticized version of the first alphabet letter.
Remember, chromatic just means half step for the most part.
In its final form, the chromatic group is heard as a progression of 3 chords of 4-part harmony. The chord progressions may ascend or descend, and their slippery chromatic nature is further enhanced by their potential to modulate suddenly from one key to another. In fact, Schillinger states that all modulations are a branch of chromatic harmony.
So he uses the word modulation. Modulation is kind of a way of, when we talk about modulation in music, we could talk about it as like changing the color of the wall in your room, right? Your room is still there. Everything that belongs to you in your room is still there, but now we've shifted the color of the wall, and then that makes us feel differently about the room. It's just a different color.
Each note is assigned a function, limited initially to 1, 3, 5, or 7. How to assign functions to the group is entirely at the discretion of the composer. What will be immediately obvious is that the same melodic group can be harmonized in dozens of different ways, and so this method offers huge potential for subtle variation.
So we have a chromatic melody going up by half step. That's what makes it chromatic. And then what he is suggesting is that because we're in this kind of slippery slope where we're not really in any one key, remember we talked about how there's different keys and different colors. Once we start to go into a chromatic place, we are no longer, again, think about what the romantics are doing. They're bending and sometimes breaking the rules. So this is exactly the kind of thing they want. They don't want us to be firmly in any, they don't want exactly a green wall or a blue wall. We're going to be in shades and gradations of the harmony, of the colors.
It's generally the case that the central member of the group, the central harmony, should be more tense or dissonant than the first and the last chords, and that if this rule is observed, a satisfying wave of harmonic flux, moving from balance to tension and then to resolution, can be established. This means that when the three extra voices are being created, care should be taken that one of the voices retains the seventh function over the middle chord.
Okay, now this is getting a little complicated, but basically what he's saying is that all of music is about tension and release, tension and release. Okay. And so the more dissonant, we use the word dissonant, that means a little bit jarring. But jarring can be a good thing. Okay. Jarring can, again, think about like a story. If nothing happens to the characters, if they get up and they make breakfast and then they go to work and nothing happens particularly interesting at work, and then they come home, they eat dinner, and then they go to bed, that's not a particularly interesting story. You would probably read 300 pages of the story and think, what exactly just happened? I'm not sure that anything happened, right? And that's the same thing with music. We want tense chords, we want dissonance, we want things that are sometimes jarring and then released to things that are more pleasing, because then something's actually happened. There's been some kind of struggle, there's been some kind of story being told in the music.
For example, the melodic group C, C sharp, D might well become C major, C sharp 7, D major. Here, the middle chord contains the dissonant seventh, while the outer chords are relatively consonant major qualities. Notice that in this case, the notes of the original chromatic group have all been taken as the roots of the final harmonies.
Okay, so that's probably all we need to talk about there. So when we start to listen to the Chopin pieces, we're going to see elements of melodic chromaticism where the pianist is playing all half steps, but then we're also going to be hearing this idea of chromatic harmony, harmonies that really don't belong and kind of blur and muddy the key area. So when we think about how we're listening to this music compared to the classical music, remember classical music is very strict and stays exactly in the key and doesn't shift very much. If it modulates color, it will only do it one time. Okay. So the romantics are doing this kind of swirling harmony. And what it sounds like to us is maybe something like, depending on the context, it could sound like sort of like outer space music. It could also sound like fantasy. It could sound like magic. A lot of the movie music that we hear is directly borrowing ideas mostly, even though it's written today, it's emulating romantic music. Because again, what are we mostly talking about in movies? We're talking about fantasy. We're talking about things, stories that in some cases might be true or based on true stories, but a lot of our movies are fiction, they're fantasy. So it makes sense that we would have our musical tradition of the romantic, which is kind of focused on supernatural and fantasy and bending and breaking rules, that would be the kind of music that would dominate a lot of our film music. All right, that's going to be the end of this. We're going to have listening lab for the Chopin pieces coming up next.